Gestapo, 3 syllables that sowed terror in Germany and throughout Europe for 12 years. The agents of this sinister institution pursued, arrested, and handed over countless multitudes, causing the death and suffering of millions of human beings in close collaboration with the SS. The men who moved the gears of this immense machinery of terror remain almost as unknown as the system they ruled. Therefore, it was essential to show them as they really were, with their flaws, their weaknesses, and in some cases even certain traits of apparent normality. Because ultimately, most of these terrifying figures were not exceptional monsters, but ordinary individuals trapped in a fate sealed the day Nazism imposed a new moral code on them. In that code, conscience was replaced by absolute obedience to the ideological dogmas of the regime. The vast majority of them never felt remorse or were able to clearly assess the magnitude of what had happened. They viewed the subsequent trials simply as a settling of scores, a natural retaliation by the victor against the defeated. For them, brutality, murder, and repression were part of the normal order, the logical course of things. They acted in this way, convinced they were doing their duty. The most calculating, however, tried to save their lives by offering privileged information or putting themselves at the service of the victors. When the Gestapo was created in April 1933, it was still a very small organization. In its first months under Rudolf Diels, it had only about 50 to 80 officers in Berlin, many of them transferred from the Prussian police. Growth was rapid. By 1934, with the absorption of police structures from other German states, the Gestapo already had several hundred agents. In 1939, under the command of Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, there were an estimated 15,000 members in total. As for their uniforms, in the early years there was no distinctive uniform. Officials usually wore civilian clothes, which made it easier for them to operate covertly and spread fear among the population, as anyone could suspect a neighbor or colleague of being a Gestapo agent. The real change came when Heinrich Himmler took command. With his implacable, disciplined, and fanatical vision, the Gestapo ceased to be a simple police agency and became the axis of totalitarian repression. Himmler had already accumulated immense power when he settled into the Gestapo headquarters at 8 Prince Albrechtstrasse, from where he spread his web of control over all of Germany, like a spider that controlled every thread of its web. On January 1st, he addressed members of the SS with a direct and unequivocal statement. Our most urgent task is to locate all enemies, both visible and hidden, of the Führer and National Socialism, defeat and annihilate them. To achieve this, we must be prepared to shed not only our own blood, but also that of others. The 18th century theosophist Jacob Böhm wrote that the body reflects the internal forces that drive it. This idea makes sense when looking at many of the Nazi leaders whose features seemed to betray their instincts. Röhm's face was marked by violence. Bormann conveyed revulsion. Heydrich and Kaltenbrunner embodied the cruelty of their actions in their features. Himmler, on the other hand, presented a different image, an ordinary, bland, almost vulgar countenance. He was of medium height, perhaps somewhat tall, with a robust build. His round face showed signs of premature baldness at the forehead and temples, despite the fact that he had been barely over 30 when he began to forge his power. He had the appearance of a common bureaucrat, an administrative clerk, or a discreet businessman. His receding chin betrayed no firmness, and his moustache barely concealed his weak expression, framed by large, prominent ears. His habitual smile gave him a certain clerical air. There were, however, 2 features that caused concern: very thin, almost colorless lips and blue eyes with a fixed, penetrating gaze, impossible to hide behind the round steel glasses he wore. Aware of this, he would tilt his head slightly to one side so that the reflection in the lenses would obscure his expression. He would thus observe his interlocutor with the intensity of a hunter studying his prey. His neck, flaccid and marked by wrinkles unbecoming of his age, surprised those who visited him. His hands, delicate and narrow, with long fingers, very pale skin, and visible veins, seemed more appropriate for a refined lady than a ruthless leader. When receiving visitors, he would often rest them motionless on the table, as if they were part of a silent mask that added to the calculated inexpressiveness of his face. Himmler's subordinates often claimed that he never directly praised or reprimanded anyone. His orders were deliberately ambiguous, forcing his men to decipher and execute as best they could what they believed he wanted. This fondness for secrecy was an essential part of his character. The more he concealed his plans, the more authority they acquired, and breaking his orders could even cost them their lives. He also stood out for his extraordinary work ethic. His day began at 8 in the morning and almost always lasted until the early hours of the morning, sometimes until 2. He never stopped working, not even during travel. On trains, planes, or automobiles, he was always accompanied by a secretary who took notes on letters and dictations. He was permanently connected by radio to Gestapo headquarters and demanded that the system be operational at all times. He didn't let any document go unchecked. He jotted down observations in the margins with a pale green pencil and marked them with GEL, followed by the date and a signature composed of 2 intertwined Gs. This seemingly minor detail revealed much about his meticulous personality. Göring, in contrast, signed his documents with bold strokes in red pencil, reflecting his ostentatious nature. When he wasn't traveling or conducting unscheduled inspections, he broke his routine only for meals. He usually ate in the SS or Gestapo officers' mess, although he occasionally went to restaurants or invited a collaborator to breakfast or dinner. At these gatherings, he appeared to be a cordial, conversational, and even jovial host. It was paradoxical that, at the height of his power, when he was in fact the most influential figure in the regime, he maintained an air of modesty. In his inner circle, he maintained childhood friendships. Many had known him since school and continued to call him Heine, a nickname that survived even within the SS, where he was respectfully referred to as Reichsheine. The contradiction was grotesque. Men responsible for thousands of deaths treating each other with affectionate diminutives as if they still shared the same innocence of the Bavarian classrooms. Himmler knew how to draw this circle of old friends into his rise. Among them was Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who would end up directing medical experiments on behalf of the regime, as well as former Munich police officers who joined the Berlin Gestapo. They all trusted in their destiny, and he, endowed with an uncanny power of persuasion, managed to convince them with the same conviction with which he himself believed in their words. Himmler showed little attachment to domestic life and seemed to lack a true personal existence outside of his work. His mind and energies were completely focused on the SS and the Gestapo, as if his purpose lay solely within those two structures. Behind this methodical facade, however, lay a deep wound, a failure in the family sphere. He married Marga Kutzerzowa, a nurse from Bromberg, 7 years his senior, who worked in a prestigious clinic in Berlin. Amid the decadent atmosphere of the capital, he witnessed so many medical abuses, illegal operations, and speculation that he eventually developed a strong aversion to the profession. Instead, he cultivated a deep faith in natural medicine and the powers of plants, an idea he passed on to his husband. With his wife's help, Himmler first attempted to set up a poultry farm in Trudering near Munich, but the project failed. Later, following Marga's advice, he devoted himself to growing medicinal herbs. He enthusiastically read ancient treatises on herbal medicine, although his attempts to turn it into a profitable business were unsuccessful. Even so, he never abandoned his fascination with medicinal plants and, once in power, ordered concentration camp prisoners to work in their production. Tensions with his wife soon emerged. The birth of his daughter Gudrun in 1928 failed to save the marriage. According to Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler suffered from partial impotence, a personal problem he never overcame and which marked his life. Even so, he staunchly opposed the divorce, citing the well-being of his daughter, although his Catholic upbringing probably influenced this decision. Over time, he began a relationship with another woman with whom he had 2 more children, raised by a wet nurse in Hohenleichen. Leading a double life caused him frequent financial problems, forcing him to take out loans. He was perhaps the only Nazi leader who did not accumulate great wealth despite his position and the climate of widespread corruption. This personal inclination toward a certain honesty led him to openly despise Göring, who shamelessly enriched himself through shady business dealings and the privileges of his office. Himmler lacked a solid cultural background. He was a man of superficial education, with romantic inclinations and obsessions that permeated the institutions he created and, to a large extent, the Third Reich itself. He believed in magnetism, mesmerism, homeopathy, the more questionable forms of naturalistic eugenics, and the mystical power of food. He trusted clairvoyants, healers, hypnotists, and even witches whom he consulted before making important decisions. He was not alone. Other Nazi leaders shared this interest in the occult in the early years of his rise, many of them clients of the famous Berlin magician Heinrich, who even predicted the Reichstag fire. Himmler professed a fervent respect for military discipline. According to Gebhardt, he took the old maxim that orders must be followed to the extreme, elevating it to dogma for the structures he led. This was not so difficult to impose in a society that, after long periods of servitude and tension, relatively easily acceded to authoritarian discipline. His interest in history and tradition led him to idealize figures from the past such as Henry I of Saxony, whom he admired for his organizational and military ability. That king's cavalry served as a model for the expansionist and racial ends he wished to promote. This cult of the past inspired rituals and symbols in the SS. For example, the nighttime oath of young recruits was celebrated by torchlight in Brunswick Cathedral before the tomb of the monarch he so venerated. Bale's psychological analysis described Himmler as incapable of formulating abstract ideas, thus taking refuge in the mechanism of the system. He was attributed traits such as an almost pathological stubbornness, excessive energy devoted to work, and a marked lack of originality or sensitivity that rendered his thinking mechanical. Added to this rigid core were a lack of practicality, boundless ambition, stubbornness, and a lack of intuition that he failed to compensate for with intellectual training. Bale also noted a disordered erotic component, an intense need for affection combined with a notable emotional coldness. In Hitler, Himmler believed he had found the messianic figure who explained and legitimized that authoritarian spirit. The Führer's simple solutions, energetic rhetoric, and charismatic leadership suited Himmler's mental disposition. When Hitler spoke of race and blood purity, he struck a chord already present in Himmler, who had believed during his time in applied agriculture that he could apply principles of animal selection to the human social order. For him, eliminating the useless was a measure of improvement, and Hitler's ideas about racial purification and the struggle for vital strength found an enthusiastic echo. Phrases extolling the elimination of the weak and the primacy of vital energy became guiding quotes that Himmler incorporated into his political and administrative actions. Hitler did not represent just a political program for Himmler. He was a totalizing ideologue. His speeches were not merely pragmatic but substituted for a faith. National Socialism was to function as a new religion with objectives, biological. According to these premises, reason and old morality were obstacles to the creation of the new man. Compassion was presented as debilitating, and politics should favor the enduring over the weak. Inspired by this vision, Himmler adopted and implemented with methodical brutality the policies that sought to realize this biological vision of society. The omnipresent Gestapo, this is what an agent of terror looked like. Himmler imposed on the Gestapo the same principles of discipline and secrecy that characterized the SS, transforming it into a closed and untouchable organization. After its creation by Göring, the political police needed a headquarters, and several buildings on Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin were vacated to house it, including the Folklore Museum and a vocational school. In 1934, Reinhard Heydrich assumed effective leadership of the Gestapo. Already head of the SS security service, he combined dual power, that of a state official and that of a senior party leader. Thus, he could use both the administrative and Nazi structures for his own ends. His subordinates were trapped in a dual obedience to the state and the party, which made any attempt at opposition or denunciation impossible. The party gradually incorporated the functions of the state. The law of December 1, 1933, unequivocally proclaimed that the National Socialist Party was becoming the bearer of the idea of the German state, thus becoming inextricably linked to official institutions. Civil servants and military commanders integrated into the NSDAP shared the same mission, to carry out the will of the party and the Führer. Their political horizon was ambitious and all-encompassing, to build the millennial Reich that had been preached, to transform social foundations for the long term, to reorganize the world map, and to promote racial supremacy to extend their dominance. The party ceased to be just another political force and became the matrix of sacred values that legitimized state action. Being expelled from its ranks was, in practice, equivalent to losing all livelihood and social position. For many, it was a sentence equivalent to ostracism. But the threat hanging over those who doubted was even more ferocious within the SS. Himmler insisted that any hint of disloyalty to the Führer, even in thought, was punishable by expulsion from the SS and a relentless pursuit of the dissident's disappearance. The Gestapo then took on the task of silencing internal debate and eradicating not only political adversaries, but also those who questioned official dogma. To achieve this, it needed an absolute presence in public and private life. Himmler and Heydrich worked for years to perfect this machinery. They built monumental archives that recorded even the smallest details of the events. Opponents. These files contained everything: political and professional activity, relationships, addresses, friendships, intimate secrets, and vulnerabilities. And they waited for the right opportunity to turn that information into a definitive weapon. What gave the Gestapo its truly terrifying power was the work of its secret intelligence apparatus, the Press and Information Agency. Although little known, its influence was decisive. Within this office operated a printing department comprised of highly skilled translators fluent in virtually all modern languages. Its main mission was to filter everything published abroad. No news item was beyond its reach, from a political article in a New York newspaper to a simple advertisement in a provincial gazette on the other side of the world. Every day, they produced bulletins with international reviews, selecting excerpts from more than 300 newspapers, and distributed them to the regime's interested offices. But the task didn't end there. Any data related to political exiles, marriages, births, deaths, meetings, or conferences was translated and carefully filed. In this way, even the most trivial details of the opposition's lives became pieces of a vast puzzle of control. Furthermore, the section compiled records measuring the influence and ideological orientation of the world's leading newspapers and journalists, information that in part directly fed into the Gestapo's files. Thanks to this mechanism, the Nazi secret police had a constant flow of information, allowing them to project the image of an omniscient organization. The network of collaborators and informants extended far beyond the borders of the Reich, and everything could be used, manipulated, and distorted for repressive purposes. Thus, in a matter of months, Germany was enveloped in an atmosphere of total mistrust, a country turned into a prison where the Gestapo seemed to be everywhere because, in fact, its shadow reached even the most distant corners of the world. The Gestapo did not rely solely on its own network to gather intelligence. Regular police and gendarmerie forces were required to forward any political information to its offices. In return, this apparatus of terror allowed minor cases to be handled by local authorities, concentrating their efforts on matters of real concern to the regime. Furthermore, Himmler directly received confidential reports from senior SS officers and influential party figures. Another fundamental channel was the interception of communications. The Nazi regime took to the extreme a procedure that already existed in many countries: wiretapping. What elsewhere could be practiced in a limited or even clandestine manner, in Germany it became a true state industry. In 1933, Göring, taking advantage of the technical advances of German engineers and the collaboration of police officers such as Rudolf Diels, created an institution with a bland name, the Hermann Research Institute. Göring, behind that facade, lay a center specialized in monitoring telephone, telegraph, and radio networks. Not only were internal communications monitored, but also calls and telegrams sent abroad, even intercepting messages between countries that did not pass through German territory. Within the Reich, the conversations of opponents, influential foreigners, and even renowned public figures were subject to systematic monitoring. The institute had cutting-edge technology capable of connecting to any line in seconds and recording key conversations. These recordings were carefully archived, and in the case of the Führer, every call was stored without exception. Daily summaries of the most relevant wiretaps were compiled and delivered to Hitler, while the ministries received timely information of interest to their departments. However, Göring, as the founder and head of the institute, reserved the right to filter information and keep to himself any revelations that could strengthen his personal power within the regime. The Eavesdropping Institute gave Göring immense influence and became a decisive weapon in his confrontation with Röhm. Aware of the value of this resource, Göring refused to cede it to Himmler and the Gestapo. Although the latter could use its services, direct control remained in Göring's hands until the fall of the Third Reich. The Gestapo, for its part, didn't need permission to implement its own methods. Its agents placed hidden microphones in the homes of suspects, often during alleged telephone line repairs or technical inspections. In this way, they spied on private conversations, even in the privacy of the home. No one was safe. In 1934, for example, Hjalmar Schacht, the acting minister, was horrified to discover that his living room had been bugged, that his employee was collaborating with the secret police, and that his nightly bedroom conversations were secretly recorded. Espionage became a constant presence in German life. Field Marshal Erhard Milch stated at Nuremberg that citizens feared the Gestapo more than the SS itself. In his words, everyone believed they were under surveillance, regardless of rank or position. The secret police accumulated files on every individual, and much of the subsequent trials were based on this documentation. No one was above suspicion. From minor employees to Reichsmarshal Göring himself, everyone knew they could be under surveillance. The fragmentation of power among Nazi institutions turned each agency into a personal fiefdom of its leader. This constant competition created a network of mutual control that, in Himmler's view, kept his rivals' excessive ambitions in check. Himmler himself skillfully maneuvered intrigues and alliances, and his relationship with Göring proved particularly useful. The existence of the institute under Göring's control, when it would have been logical to include it within the central structure of the political police, shows how Himmler knew how to compromise on certain grounds to obtain greater benefits. However, the Gestapo and the SD eventually installed secret wiretaps against Göring himself, which destroyed any balance. In this struggle for supremacy, marked by distrust, calculated coldness, and systematic cruelty, Himmler found in Reinhard Heydrich to his most effective ally, a brilliant, relentless collaborator with the political talent necessary to consolidate his dominance. Who was Heydrich, and what was his role in the Gestapo? In the summer of 1932, Heinrich Himmler decided to reorganize the SS intelligence apparatus. Aware of Reinhard's training and talent, Heydrich, in this regard, appointed him responsible for the reorganization and promoted him to the rank of Standartenführer. Until then, each SS detachment had only a small group of 2 or 3 men tasked with overseeing security and intelligence matters. As Himmler himself recalled, the mission of these agents was simple but crucial. They had to anticipate the movements of their adversaries, know in advance if the communists were planning a rally, if there was a possibility of an ambush or any other action directed against party members. As early as 1931, Himmler had decided to separate these intelligence officers from the rest of the SS to form an independent structure. It was then that the Sicherheitsdienst, better known as the SD, was born, which he gave the title of Reichsführer Security Service, SS. Although in its early years it remained an internal tool intended for Himmler's personal protection and to guarantee the security of the SS organization, this unit would soon become the core of the Nazi intelligence system. Heydrich. He was a man with a turbulent past who would soon send shivers down the spines of many Germans, although he appeared harmless on the surface. He presented himself as a tall Aryan officer with refined manners, with straight, stiff, reddish-blonde hair neatly parted into 2 unequal sections. His bearing was imposing and majestic, with the military poise so valued at the time. His face was unmistakable, a broad, sunken forehead covered small blue eyes, framed by heavy, half-closed eyelids, which gave his gaze an enigmatic air. That slanted expression, which some associated with distant Asian features, would have been enough to contradict Himmler's racial theories had he cared to dwell on it. His long oval face lacked large ears that would have spoiled the harmony of his features. He had a straight, elongated nose, somewhat wide at the base and too thin at the top. His wide mouth, with thick, well-defined lips, stood out powerfully against that virile countenance. His voice was also striking, strangely high-pitched for a man of his athletic build, as if 2 tones higher than normal clashed with the solidity of his body. His hands, white, slender, and well cared for, had the delicacy and expressiveness of a woman's. It was impossible not to notice how he accompanied each word with lively gestures, as expressive as his own face. While Himmler sought to hide his emotions behind the cold mask of imperturbability, Heydrich was unable to control his explosive temper. His speech was halting, rushed by thoughts that rushed ahead of his words. He feared, above all, being misunderstood, and this urgency made him stumble over his own sentences. The discordance of his features, a mixture of opposing traits that gave the impression of an ambiguous face, was a direct reflection of his complex personality. Heydrich presented himself as a cultured and sociable man. He stood out as a superb horseman and swordsman, considered among the best fencers of his time, and he also displayed a refined taste for the arts. His passion for music was well known. As a highly talented violinist, he took great care of his hands and often delighted select circles at private soirees where he received applause for performances of remarkable quality. However, beneath that elegant facade and his fondness for all things British lay bursts of character that disturbed those around him. His private life revealed a marked imbalance. Always in search of new sensations, he did not hesitate to explore the most sordid neighborhoods of Berlin with his loved ones, spending the night in taverns and cafes until he ended up in brothels, famous for offering the darkest excesses. Not even his high position prevented him from such adventures. But what truly distinguished him was his boundless cruelty. Even the harshest Gestapo torturers feared him, having witnessed him act with a sadism that surpassed that of the most brutal executioners. This trait, combined with a keen intellect, an iron will, and boundless pride, made him a formidable figure. Himmler valued the discipline with which Heydrich covered up his excesses, although beneath that controlled mask lay an insatiable arrogance. In the early years of the regime, when Hitler was still consolidating his power, Heydrich even went so far as to investigate rumors about the Führer's family origins, a field that many steered clear of. The genealogical obsession that ran through the Nazi elite found a curious echo when, after his death, Wilhelm Canaris claimed to have found documents among his belongings that suggested Jewish ancestry. His temper was volcanic. He easily lost control, exploding with shouts, insults, and threats against his subordinates, although these outbursts were always confined to his office. In his private life, he was gripped by a morbid jealousy toward his wife, a distant woman who pushed him to climb the ladder to achieve the standard of living she desired. Heydrich constantly monitored her, obsessed with her fidelity. Envy consumed him, not only toward his adversaries but also toward the achievements of his friends. He coveted power, prestige, and wealth, and knew no limits in his pursuit of them. Heydrich often repeated a maxim that defined him: everything depends on the leader. In his quest to consolidate power, he turned internal rivalry into a method of control. He deliberately pitted his collaborators against each other, exploited them to the limit, and when they ceased to be useful or became a threat because of their talents, he eliminated them from his circle without hesitation. This system of reciprocal surveillance, conceived in the style of Nazism, allowed him to maintain absolute supremacy over his entourage. He did not hesitate to challenge even the most influential figures in the regime. His direct and calculating style earned him powerful enemies. He felt a visceral hatred for Canaris, Bohl, and Ribbentrop, and even clashed with Himmler. However, all these political battles were fought in the shadows. His taste for violence was intertwined with an obsession with secrecy, which probably stemmed from a deep inferiority complex. Within his circle, subordinates avoided using his name and referred to him by an enigmatic nickname, S. He had a strange inability to look anyone in the eye when speaking, and although he could be ruthless behind closed doors, he rarely directly struck an adversary who challenged him head-on. This contradiction revealed the ambiguous nature of a man who combined brutality and psychological fragility. His intimate adherence to Nazi ideals led him to become not only an executor but also an ideologue. From his leadership of the SD, he transformed it into an organization that not only controlled the conduct of SS members, but also their doctrinal purity. He presented himself as a moral guardian, when in reality behind that cloak was a murderer disguised as a preacher. From his office at Prinz Albrechtstrasse 8, Reinhard Heydrich calmly and precisely built a vast network of control that would eventually extend throughout the Reich. In just 5 years, he managed to consolidate a system of espionage and repression so efficient that it transformed Germany into a nation under surveillance in every corner. By 1934, some of the most astute observers were already warning that this power structure was inevitably leading the country toward a conflict of global proportions. The Gestapo rules Poland, the iron fist of the Reich. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, as SS units carried out the mass purification of the civilian population in the occupied Soviet zones, Himmler addressed SS officers to encourage them in the face of the accumulating horrors that even they viewed with shock. He starkly reminded them that the work they were doing in those territories, forced relocation and repression, was necessary and urged them to continue with determination, even if it meant mass shootings and extreme measures against entire populations. Poland soon became a laboratory for these practices. In its towns and territories, under the administration of the general government, techniques of control, expulsion, and annihilation were experimented with and perfected, which would later be applied on a massive scale throughout the continent. Barely at the end of the military campaign, on October 7, 1939, Hitler signed a decree backed by Göring and Keitel, appointing Himmler as commissioner responsible for establishing the German race in the seized lands and granting him full powers to carry out what was known as Germanization. The mandate conferred on Himmler gave him carte blanche to transform the territory demographically and culturally. He was authorized to move settlers of German blood to those areas, to eradicate the influence of populations considered foreign, and to establish German settlements. Himmler clearly explained his vision. It was not about assimilating the inhabitants through teaching them the German language or German laws, but rather ensuring that the East remained inhabited only by pure Germans. This racial logic was the cornerstone of his policy. To materialize this idea, he implemented systematic measures, weakening and excluding the Polish cultural elite, distributing expropriated property among German settlers, and, in a particularly brutal manner, the selection and appropriation of minors considered racially appropriatable. Himmler reasoned without apparent emotion that it was lawful to separate children from their families and integrate them into German families or institutions if it would produce good blood. In his cold and pragmatic speech, he justified this practice as a way of extracting elements. Useful racial groups and, when necessary, did not hesitate to define the expulsion or elimination of entire groups as an inevitable part of the process of building the Reich. Poles and Jews were dispossessed of their property. Houses, farms, and land passed into the hands of those the regime defined as settlers, that is, pure-blooded Germans brought from abroad and resettled in the conquered territories. The former owners were subjected to different fates depending on the category in which they were classified by the Nazi establishment. Many Jews and those considered potential enemies ended up interned in concentration camps. Others were deported to Germany to work in war industries or on farms, and many were forced to continue farming their old plots under conditions of servitude. To organize this process, Himmler approved a racial census on December 12, 1940, which classified the population into groups. On the one hand, pure-blood Germans active in the party, then non-political pure-blood Germans, then the relatives and spouses of pure Germans, and finally the descendants of Germans already integrated into the Polish community, the so-called Polonized, who were seen as renegades and subjected to a re-education program designed to restore their German status. Those who refused this process or tried to avoid registration were handed over to the Gestapo and often sent to the camps. The person in charge of implementing the policy of expropriations, deportations, and resettlements was Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA. From this structure, the confiscation of property, the evacuation of populations, the mass shipment of workers to German factories, and the establishment of settlers in the liberated lands were planned, both in the annexed areas and in the so-called general government administered by Hans Frank. The radicalization of these policies led to the systematic elimination of the Jews. Hans Frank unreservedly proclaimed the need for their annihilation, and in 1940 the Auschwitz camp, conceived as an extermination facility, was opened near Krakow. Amid the damp, mud-ridden wastelands of the region, millions of Jews would be murdered over the next 5 years. Auschwitz was followed by other extermination centers, including Majdanek and Treblinka. The latter would be used as a model for the structure and procedures of the death camps that would follow. The Poles deported to Germany were reduced to slavery under the supervision of the Gestapo. As agricultural workers, they were governed by a 15-point regulation that deprived them of basic rights. They could not complain, were subject to strict curfews, and were prohibited from assembling, changing owners, using public transportation, or attending churches and cultural venues. They were punished corporally without the owners being held accountable, and any minor infraction, from slowness at work to insolence, was considered a crime. Polish women were assigned as servants in German households, primarily in families of Nazi Party members. Between 400,000 and 500,000 were forced into unpaid servitude, with only 3 hours of leave per week. They were required to carry a work ID card at all times and were subject to the same restrictions as men. In practice, Polish men and women lived under a regime of legalized slavery, while German society, from peasants to industrialists, accepted and even exploited this system, normalizing brutal inhumanity in just 7 years of Nazi rule. The Gestapo imposed a new order that degraded hundreds of thousands of adults to extreme levels of deprivation and humiliation. The situation of children was even more agonizing. In some camps, children under 8 years old, half-naked and malnourished, pulled carts or carried bundles. The omnipresence of the secret police cast its shadow over the entire subjugated mass of humanity. The effectiveness of the repressive measures even provoked frivolous comments from Nazi officials. In an interview on February 6, 1940, with Völkischer correspondent Kleist, Beobachter Hans Frank even mocked the punitive actions of his colleague von Neurath in Bohemia and Moravia, comparing them to the executions in Poland and making a hyperbolic comment about the amount of paper needed to publish posters every time prisoners were shot. The plan for mass deportations was quickly implemented. On January 25, 1940, Frank announced his intention to transport 1 million Polish workers to Germany. The Gestapo organized raids, and within a few years the scheme was operational on a massive scale. By August 1942, approximately 800,000 Poles had been deported to meet the Reich's labor needs. With the offensive against Western Europe in May 1940, international attention shifted and the Nazi leadership seized the moment. Frank was explicit. While the world's eyes were on the Western Front, it was the ideal opportunity to eliminate the leading figures of the Polish intelligentsia. The decision to annihilate these elites had been made months earlier, in September 1939. The invasion of the West offered the political alibi to carry it out with less external visibility. Thus was born Operation AB, Emergency Pacification Action, planned and coordinated by the authorities in Warsaw. Frank called in his State Secretary Joseph Bühler and Seyss-Inquart to finalize the details. The RSHA contributed then his men, Streckenbach, head of the 1st Directorate, and SS units transported from Germany. The operation was conceived as a covert cleanup under the pretext of restoring security and stopping alleged unrest. Mass arrests began in November 1939, including professors from the University of Krakow. It quickly became clear that deporting them to German camps was cumbersome and would generate unwanted communication with their families. The solution was more brutal and practical: concentrated arrests, sham trials, and local executions. Frank clearly instructed that any judicial interference would be treated as treason and that the AB was to be carried out exclusively by the police and the SS, outside of ordinary legal channels. Thus, deprived of due process and any possibility of review, Polish intellectuals and leaders were systematically eliminated by the Gestapo and security forces. When the operation concluded, Streckenbach returned to Berlin and resumed his administrative duties. A formal ceremony was even held in his honor, at which Frank delivered words of congratulations for a job well done, coldly closing the cycle of bureaucratic violence. While the Gestapo and the SD spread terror in Poland, Heydrich did not neglect his other duties. The tensions that arose in certain sectors of the army during the planning of the aggression against Czechoslovakia were quickly detected thanks to the SD's extensive network of informants. In August 1938, for example, the service learned that General Kleist had traveled to London, although it was unable to definitively identify who the conspirators' messenger was or the precise objectives of the mission. Himmler was aware that the envoy had brought a letter from Churchill, but beyond that detail, no additional information could be obtained. A year later, on the eve of the invasion of Poland, concerns resurfaced in some military circles, albeit with little determination. Faced with this climate of doubt, Himmler and Heydrich ordered a thorough examination to determine the extent of the unrest and, above all, whether there were links between the covert opposition in Germany and the British secret services. The internal investigation yielded no clear results, so the investigation turned external, focusing on British contacts themselves. For this delicate operation, they chose two young SD officers in whom they placed great confidence, Walter Schellenberg and Helmut Knochen. Both came from modest families and had emerged from the student environment that Nazism was trying to capitalize on. Heydrich perceived that any serious approach to the British required cultured men with refined manners, an elegant command of the English, and sufficient cunning to avoid the pitfalls that would inevitably arise in conversations. Over time, events would prove that the choice had been correct. The Year of Terror, the Gestapo at its widest expansion. The word hostility is too weak to describe the avalanche of hatred and impotent rage that arose in those who confronted the methods of the Gestapo and its sinister machinery of death. Arrests increased steadily and reached their peak between May and August 1944. In southern France, especially in the Lyon region, arrests were carried out in two ways. On the one hand, by individually detaining individuals identified or suspected of activities contrary to the German occupation. On the other, by means of large-scale raids that devastated entire neighborhoods. Some of the most massive operations took place in France in August and December 1941, in July 1942 with the capture of thousands of Jews, in November 1943 at the University of Strasbourg, transferred to Clermont-Ferrand, in January 1943 in Marseille with 40,000 detainees, on December 24, 1943 in Grenoble, on December 24, 1944 in Cluny, in May 1944 in Figeac and Aisieux, and in July 1944 in Saint-Paul-de-Léon and Locmine. Similar strategies were employed in Belgium, the Netherlands and Denmark. In Central and Eastern Europe, however, repression reached even more brutal proportions. Entire populations were subjected to indiscriminate arrests, forced expulsions, mass deportations and slave labor. The repression spread without limits, leaving behind a trail of terror and destruction. The Gestapo's interrogations of those arrested were almost always accompanied by torture. Generally, unless there was a particular urgency, the first session did not take place immediately, but rather weeks after the arrest. The methods of coercion were similar in all the centers. Prisoners were forced to kneel on wooden edges while pressure was applied to their shoulders. On other occasions, they were hung by their arms until they lost consciousness. Blows with fists, kicks, and whips fashioned from animal sinew were common. When the victim fainted, they were revived with cold water. Mutilations, such as filing teeth, pulling out nails, and burning with cigarettes and blowtorches were also performed. Electric shocks were another procedure. One cable was attached to the foot and the other to intimate areas of the body. The skin on the soles of the feet was also cut, and the prisoner was forced to walk on salt. In some cases, rags soaked in gasoline were placed between the toes and set on fire. One of the cruelest forms of torture involved immersing the detainee, handcuffed in icy water. His head was pushed beneath the surface until he was almost drowning, and then, holding him by the hair, they lifted him up to force him to breathe. If he refused to give information, the process was repeated over and over again. Women were not immune to torment either. With them, the executioners often resorted to more calculated and devious methods. Gestapo collaborators in France competed with their German superiors by devising increasingly atrocious procedures. In the country, virtually no one was unaware of the existence of torture. Some denied it for political convenience, others thought the testimonies were exaggerated. But medical reports, autopsies, material evidence, and even the confessions of the executioners themselves, replete with details, confirmed the brutality of methods that were indescribable in their cruelty. Each Gestapo branch operated autonomously, without coordination with the others due to internal rivalries and secrecy rules. Thus, it was common for several branches to request the same detainee for interrogation on the same day. The prisoner was transported in compartmentalized vehicles, usually from the Fresnes prison, and awaited his turn in makeshift cells. On the Rue de Saussay, the cells were distributed throughout the building. In the basements, there were some slightly larger ones, while on the upper floors, service rooms were converted into makeshift cells. There, 5 or 6 people were crammed into small, stifling spaces, handcuffed or chained to rings fixed to the wall, waiting for long hours. When it was time for interrogation, the prisoner was greeted with a barrage of blows. If he fell to the ground, he was kicked up and beaten so violently that he often suffered fractured ribs or shattered limbs. The sessions could last for hours, combining threats directed at the detainee's family, often carried out with false promises of leniency. The accused were forced to remain standing without pause, while the executioners took turns maintaining the rhythm of beatings and intimidation. To break the resistance of the staunchest, methods considered more sophisticated were used. The sadism of the executioners seemed to know no bounds, and their creativity in devising new forms of torment multiplied without ceasing, generating techniques that their authors themselves proudly displayed. It was reminiscent of medieval times when executors passed down the secrets of the trade from generation to generation. The climate of indulgence granted by the Nazi regime, combined with the circumstances of war, opened the door for the darkest instincts to surface in individuals who, on the surface, had been ordinary and proper people. Some excused themselves by claiming they were simply following the general trend or that they feared being accused of treason if they didn't participate. Others, however, had no qualms about admitting they found pleasure in such torture sessions. The suffering of others became their source of entertainment and power. Thus, these inhuman practices were not confined to the large centers of repression but spread like a plague, even present in the most modest local Gestapo office, where cruelty always found fertile ground. These tortures were inflicted on people already weakened by confinement. By then, around 40,000 prisoners had died in French prisons. Added to this number were those executed by French, German, or military courts, along with those eliminated without trial in concentration camps set up on French soil. The detainees were confined in tiny cells within overcrowded prisons, where 15 men could be squeezed into just 7 or 8 square meters. Food was scarce. They lived surrounded by indescribable filth, covered in parasites without receiving letters, packages, or visitors, completely isolated from the outside world. Only a steely fortitude, an almost superhuman willpower allowed them to withstand the pain and pressure to avoid betraying their comrades who remained at large. Most couldn't bear it. Many collapsed, both in body and spirit, under the torment they suffered. But in such conditions, who could dare judge them? When the Gestapo felt it could obtain no more information from a detainee, it sent him into exile on a deportation train or handed him over to a German court. In the case of exile, the sentence was a slow death, marked by forced labor, hunger, disease, and abuse. The transfers were carried out in cattle cars packed with between 100 and 120 people. The journeys, which usually lasted 3 days, took place in darkness, stifling heat, and a complete lack of water or food. On convoys to Buchenwald and Dachau, approximately a quarter of the prisoners died before arrival. Between January 1st and August 25th, 1944, the date on which the last convoy left, 326 trains left France, not counting those from Alsace and Lorraine. Each one carried between 1,000 and 2,000 deportees. The number of annual trains shows the increasing pace of repression: 3 in 1940, 19 in 1941, 104 in 1942, and 257 in 1943. In total, some 250,000 people were expelled from France, of whom barely 35,000 returned, most of them physically and mentally devastated. At Dachau, the gas chambers that held around 300 people in 1942 were enlarged the following year to hold 1,000, and by 1945 could hold 2,000. Life inside the concentration camps has been described in detail in numerous testimonies from survivors. Those who managed to escape alive understood firsthand the essence of Nazism. It was a universe of slaves subjected to the whim of a handful of masters, where freedom did not exist. From their arrival, prisoners were warned that they would never leave alive. In some camps, new arrivals heard the macabre phrase, "There is only one way out here, the chimney." In others, a sign at the entrance repeated the same message. The Nazi joke was permeated by the unbearable stench of the crematoriums. The administration of the camps was left in the hands of the SS, under the direct control of Himmler and his death's head units created specifically for that purpose. The main administrative and economic office, headed by Oswald Pohl, oversaw the entire organization. The Gestapo, for its part, after overcrowding the camps with thousands of prisoners, limited its role to political control. The internal language of the regime was repetitive. Himmler was the absolute master of the concentration camps, master of even the most insignificant personnel. Himmler, Heydrich, and later Kaltenbrunner made regular visits to the concentration camps. They observed firsthand the forced labor that led to the prisoners' deaths, attended executions, and toured the extermination facilities, including the gas chambers. In that universe of horror, the macabre had become routine. Corpses were stripped of dental crowns and gold prostheses, which were sent to the SS economic department along with eyeglass frames and wedding rings. On one occasion, Oswald Pohl was invited to a banquet by the Reichsbank. Before dinner, the senior officials toured the bank's cellars, where they were shown chests of goods from the camps. Melted ingots of gold torn from the victims, stacked spectacle frames, fountain pens, and complete teeth were displayed in piles. After viewing this sinister wealth, the guests quietly made their way to the banquet table. When the Allies occupied the camps, they found remnants of this loot, almost 21,000 kilograms of gold ingots and dozens of cartloads of furs. Companies that used slave labor were also not left out. Prisoners' wages never reached them. They were transferred directly to the SS Economic Service. In 1943 alone, these Reichsbank accounts exceeded 100 million marks. Nothing was wasted. Even the unthinkable was exploited. The bones of the dead were ground up to make fertilizer, and human fat was transformed into soap. It was the culmination of a system that turned death into a business. When the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, it found a gruesome discovery: 7 tons of hair belonging to some 140,000 women. The fate of this material was clarified shortly afterward when an internal order from the camp administration dated August 6, 1942, came to light. In it, SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl instructed that women's hair should be used in industry, being used to make slippers for U-boat crews and insoles for Reich railway workers. In the case of men's hair, it was only considered useful if it reached a minimum length of 2 centimeters. The circular concluded with a bureaucratic requirement. The camps had to report the quantities collected each month before the 5th on the quantities collected, differentiating between men and women. The Gestapo was responsible for filling this hellhole and maintaining its population. The decision to send someone to a concentration camp rested solely in their hands. Only a few signatures were valid. Those of Heydrich as head of the RSHA, his successor Kaltenbrunner, and in their absence that of Müller himself, head of the Gestapo. When labor was needed, it was their decision. A directive from Müller on December 17, 1942, ordered that 35,000 prisoners fit for work be transferred to concentration camps by the end of January 1943. Within each camp, the Gestapo had its own arm, the so-called political section. This structure was feared by all and a source of tension with the camp command, which viewed its privileges with suspicion. Upon admission of a new prisoner, they were subjected to an exhaustive interrogation to gather information about their life. A file was opened with all the documentation, and a centralized archive maintained files that allowed access to detailed information at any time. The section chief could summon any detainee at will, and this summons was one of the biggest nightmares. Many never returned after being taken there. The fear was such that some even died from heart attacks caused by the terror of receiving a summons. The Gestapo also encouraged espionage among prisoners. Recruiting informants was extremely difficult, as the mere suspicion of snitching was tantamount to a death sentence among fellow inmates. Cases deemed serious were resolved in the bunker, the camp's internal prison, where unbridled atrocities were committed. There, detainees were stripped naked, brutally tortured, and almost always executed after interrogation. Every freed prisoner leaving a camp was required to immediately and obligatorily report to the Gestapo in the town where he or she was to reside on the designated date. Before his or her final departure, he or she was made to pass through the camp's political section to sign a declaration promising never to reveal what he or she had seen or describe the prisoner's living conditions. After 1940, such releases became virtually non-existent. At Buchenwald, nothing was left to chance. Upon arrival, Soviet prisoners were sent to the political section under the label special treatment, a bureaucratic formula that covered the process of systematic elimination. Political commissars were the first victims, followed by officers, Komsomol leaders, and communist militants. To identify cadres and activists, informants from the White Guards were placed in the camps, who identified officers and political leaders among the newly deported. Himmler proudly claimed the systematic architecture of this terror. In one of his writings, he justified the existence of the camps by describing their inhabitants as marginal and dangerous elements, and defended the education practiced there as a method of imposing discipline and order. In his view, only through rigid discipline could humanity be achieved, which in his language belonged exclusively to the German people. The camps were also exhibition spaces. Delegations from the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the party frequently came to view the inmates. One former prisoner recalled the feeling of being watched like a zoo animal. A carefully prepared spectacle was arranged for the visitor, a parade of victims in which common criminals, ousted officials, foreign officials, people accused of their sexual orientation, Roma, clergy, Polish nobles and academics appeared one after another. This grotesque staging, in which prisoners selected for their shortcomings or prestige were paraded to laughter and applause, responded to a deliberate strategy to show society the degradation of the enemy and consolidate dehumanization as a political tool. The myth of German racial superiority served as the ideological foundation for the planned extermination. An order signed by Himmler on August 11, 1942, clearly illustrated this absurd logic. It authorized corporal punishment of German prisoners, but it could only be carried out by other inmates of the same nationality. A rule that, far from providing comfort, condemned many to die under the beatings of their own countrymen. These regulations were overseen by Gestapo officers who also controlled the internal administration of the camps. Their work included drafting regular reports for Müller, who forwarded them to Heydrich, who then sent them to Himmler. It is revealing that some Mauthausen officials were disciplined for administrative errors, while the camp's chief doctor unconcernedly ordered the deaths of 2 newly arrived young Dutch Jews, only to keep their teeth and make a grotesque paperweight for his office. In this closed universe, Nazism imposed its own ruthless logic. Mass killing, organized using industrial methods, was considered routine for the SS, who were merely following orders. What in today's eyes seems a monstrous crime, for them was a duty. In contrast, even the smallest bureaucratic misconduct was judged an unforgivable offense against the principles of the party, whose doctrine was presented as the only possible truth. Within this mentality, the murder of prisoners was not seen as a crime. The Nazis equated it with the work of a slaughterer in a slaughterhouse, as natural as slaughtering an animal. For them, members of races considered inferior or enemies of the Reich deserved no compassion, and their extermination was seen as a legitimate and even honorable act. As for Gestapo prisoners, releases were virtually non-existent. Even without serious charges, they were rarely released. If serious suspicions arose during interrogations or confessions were extracted through torture, the case could be referred to a military tribunal. In Paris, this tribunal was located at 11 Rue Boissy d'Anglars. Although in theory they acted independently, any sentence was useless. Both those convicted and acquitted were returned to the custody of the Gestapo, which freely decided their fate. Those who remained in prisons such as Fresnes, La Santé or Cherche Midi were sent after trial or even without it to Fort Romainville, where their fate was sealed by the direct decision of the secret police. The twilight of the Gestapo, the final fall. Between August 1944 and March 1945, Himmler reached the height of his power. After the failed assassination attempt on July 20th, he eliminated his rivals and achieved his dream of becoming commander of an army group. From then on, he accumulated more positions than any other Nazi leader. Minister of the Interior, Minister of Health, Supreme Commander of the Police, Intelligence Services, and civilian and military secret agencies. As Reichsführer, SS, he commanded an armed force that by early 1945 comprised 38 divisions, 4 brigades, 10 foreign legions, 10 special commandos, and 35 independent units, troops marked by their fanaticism. He also controlled multiple party and state structures, both in Berlin and in the provinces. In his new role as army commander, he began maneuvering to concentrate the last remaining levers of power in the dying Reich in his hands. Göring, once a direct competitor in the struggle for power, had been relegated to a nearly irrelevant role. His shady dealings and displays of wealth had plunged him into disrepute, depriving him of the influence he had once enjoyed. Ribbentrop suffered a similar fate. His diplomacy, once presented as the Reich's greatest asset, had failed on all fronts. Göring himself publicly ridiculed him, calling him a vulgar champagne peddler, a comment that brought a smile to Hitler's face, who forgot that he had recently compared him to a new Bismarck. Of the hierarchs, Goebbels still held a share of power, although in that arena Bormann far surpassed him. The latter, driven by relentless ambition and a blind faith in Nazi ideology, climbed the ranks until he eliminated those who stood in his way. From Reichsleiter and Chief of Staff under Hess, he became, after Hess's defection, the Führer's representative and director of the party secretariat. In practice, he assumed absolute control of the entire political machinery. On April 12, 1943, he added the position of Hitler's personal secretary, consolidating his position as the key figure around the Führer. Bormann quickly realized that his most serious opponent was Himmler. He easily perceived his ambitions and plans, but he also detected his great weakness, his absolute ineptitude as a military leader. He based his strategy of attrition on this flaw. In this maneuver, he used Hermann Fegelein as a tactical piece. Fegelein, an SS general and liaison between Hitler and Himmler's headquarters, also held a privileged position. He was married to Gretel Braun, Eva Braun's sister, making him the Führer's brother-in-law. This family relationship guaranteed him closeness and influence within Hitler's inner circle. Meeting daily with Bormann, he eventually aligned himself with him, becoming a key informant and collaborator. Through Fegelein, Himmler's errors were exposed and magnified. Every mistake in his duties as an army group commander was highlighted as proof of his incompetence. Finally, after the disastrous retreat in Pomerania, Himmler was removed from his post in March. At the same time, in Hungary, where the front was crumbling, elite SS troops were sent under the direction of Sepp Dietrich, an old veteran of National Socialism, to try to contain the situation. In this context, Bormann saw the perfect opportunity to strike the final blow against his old rival. Himmler's demotion reached a definitive and massive point, sealing his exclusion from the struggle for power. His dedication to military command had removed him for too long from police control, precisely when that function was vital in the Reich's agonizing context. During his absence, both Bormann and Hitler himself grew accustomed to dealing directly with Kaltenbrunner, leaving Himmler relegated to the background. Even many of the Führer's orders no longer passed through his hands, a clear sign of his loss of influence. On April 19th, Himmler held a long conversation with Schwerin von Krosigk, the Minister of Finance, while Schellenberg tried to convince the Minister of Labour, Zelt. All agreed on one conclusion: Hitler must be removed, and the only way forward was for Himmler to take command and seek an honourable peace. These new conspirators clung to the same illusions that had accompanied previous plots. Himmler, convinced that he could make a breakthrough, placed his hopes in Count Foch. Bernadotte. In their last interview, Bernadotte suggested that Himmler declare Hitler incapacitated due to a sudden illness and declare himself head of state, followed by the dissolution of the National Socialist Party. Himmler was willing to implement this belated plan, but feared that the Allies would refuse to negotiate with him and sought a prior guarantee. On 21st April, after leaving the Reich Chancellery, he met with Schellenberg, and together they travelled to the Hohenlichen Hospital outside Berlin, where he had planned to meet with Bernadotte. At that meeting, Himmler promised to stop the evacuation of the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg, and begged the Swedish diplomat to convey his proposals to Eisenhower, with whom he hoped to meet directly. Bernadotte tried to make him understand that his role in the Germany of the future would be null, and the conversation ended without concrete results. Despite this, Himmler, like a shipwrecked sailor clinging to a splinter, did not abandon his hopes. After Bernadotte left for Sweden via Lübeck, he decided to follow him to reiterate his proposal for a ceasefire and to accept, this time unconditionally, Hitler's elimination. Schellenberg arrived in Lübeck first, but discovered that Bernadotte had already crossed the border and was in Appenrad, north of Flensburg. Through a phone call, he managed to convince him to meet in Flensburg and then persuaded him to return to Lübeck, where Himmler was waiting for him. The meeting took place on the evening of April 23rd in the basement of the Swedish consulate, lit only by candles due to power outages caused by constant bombing. During 5 hours of talks, Bernadotte agreed to take Himmler's proposals to his government, although he stressed that only he would decide whether they would be passed on to the Allies. Himmler immediately drafted a letter to the Swedish Foreign Minister Christian Gunther requesting that he facilitate the delivery of his offer to the Americans. However, the following day, a statement by President Truman categorically ruled out any partial surrender, dashing the Reichsführer, SS's last hopes. On April 22nd, Himmler learned that Hitler had ordered the execution of his former personal physician Karl Brandt for having sent his wife to the United States. Brandt's arrest in Thuringia confirmed that even confined in the bunker, Hitler still retained the power to impose his will. Himmler's last desperate journey began. After bidding farewell to Count Bernadotte in Lübeck, he began circling the few territories that had not yet fallen into Allied hands, like a predator trapped in an ever-closing cage. His first impulse was to head for Berlin, unaware that his betrayal of the Führer had already been exposed. However, the path to the capital was blocked. He then changed course and reached Fürstenberg, where the military command was located. There, on the 26th of April, he received news of Göring's alleged disloyalty, the failure of his own attempts at negotiation, and Hitler's order to arrest the marshal. He then decided to return north towards the Danish border in order to meet up with Schellenberg. Schellenberg had been instructed to accompany Bernadotte to Flensburg and continue diplomatic talks there, as he had the necessary authority to do so. Schellenberg was already in Denmark and returned to Flensburg on the 30th of April, only to learn that he had been stripped of his responsibilities. Hitler, fully aware of his involvement in Himmler's maneuvers, had not forgiven him. His duties were immediately transferred to Obersturmbannführer Bank, head of the SD's political section, and to Otto Skorzeny in command of the military division. Schellenberg, however, was barely affected by the blow. He immediately travelled to Travemünde, north of Lübeck, where he met with Himmler. On May 1st, they received the news that changed everything. Hitler had fallen and Karl Dönitz was taking over as his successor. Himmler had already seen Dönitz the day before in Plön, a few kilometers from Lübeck, the headquarters of the Wehrmacht's inter-army headquarters. He decided to return there immediately to consult the next steps. For his part, Schellenberg, who accompanied him, chose to maintain contact with Schwerin von Krosigk, a member of the new government. That same evening, he left for Denmark to continue his negotiations. After returning briefly to Plön, he set off for Stockholm, where he would eventually become involved in the preparations for the German capitulation. Himmler joined the new cabinet, which on the 4th of May moved its headquarters from Plön to Mürwik, settling in the Naval Academy near Flensburg. There, Dönitz was surrounded by exhausted officers and disoriented leaders. Keitel, Jodl, and other high-ranking officers still entertained the absurd idea of prolonging the war in Norway. Dönitz himself summoned Reich Commissioner Terboven and Generals Böhm and Lindemann to discuss the possibility of maintaining resistance in Scandinavia. Many Nazi leaders trying to save their own skins attended to curry favor with the new government. That elite, unable to admit defeat, preferred to multiply the suffering of the German population rather than accept the inevitable. Meanwhile, Allied bombing continued to needlessly claim lives. Amidst this tangle of rumors, intrigue, and despair, Himmler tried to disappear from the scene. On May 6th, the Flensburg government decided on the total surrender of the Reich, and that same day the Reichsführer, SS, was removed from his duties. He had become a dead weight. Sensing the danger that surrounded him, he disappeared. On May 8th at midnight, the fighting ceased on all European fronts. For the first time since the invasion of Poland in 1939, the continent fell silent. Himmler was hiding. All indications are that he remained in the vicinity of Flensburg with a small group of SS loyalists seeking to escape reprisals. Allied forces distributed his photograph throughout the region, and it was clear that many Germans would have betrayed him if they had known of his hiding place. Nevertheless, he managed to remain invisible for almost 2 weeks. On May 20th, he decided to leave the north and head for Bavaria, accompanied by a dozen officers. The next day, between Hamburg and Bremen, amid a tide of refugees advancing on foot or hailing transport, a small group emerged. The landscape was desolate, marshy lands alternating with stunted pine forests bordering the Teufelsmoor or Devil's Swamp. The human column was stopped at a British checkpoint. Among those who presented themselves, A man handed over military documents under the false name of Heinrich Himmler. His left eye was covered by a black patch, and he was dressed in a confusing mix of civilian and uniform clothes, a detail that made him go unnoticed among so many displaced people. But his surprisingly new papers aroused suspicion in the sentry, who was accustomed to the fact that most refugees lacked documentation. With a gesture, the British soldier ordered him to be removed. 2 guards escorted him to the checkpoint and handed him over to the security service of the Second Army based in Lüneburg. They locked him in a makeshift cell to await further orders. No one at that moment imagined that the individual with an eye patch was none other than Heinrich Himmler, who had shaved off his characteristic moustache, a detail that gave him an uncanny resemblance to Hitler himself. Realizing that his disguise wouldn't protect him for long, Himmler decided to take an unexpected turn. He requested an interview with the local commander, and upon entering his office, he removed the black armband that falsely identified him. In a firm voice, he declared, "I am Heinrich Himmler. I wish to convey an urgent message to Marshal Montgomery. It is not known for certain whether he intended to gain a leading role in the negotiations or whether he hoped to find an opportunity to escape during the transfer. What is certain is that he was immediately sent to Lüneburg, headquarters of the British Second Army, and placed in the custody of the security services. In Lüneburg, the strict security measures appropriate for a prisoner of that category were applied. He was subjected to a medical examination and thoroughly searched. A capsule of potassium cyanide was found in one of his pockets. He was wearing a worn British uniform and was held until the arrival of Colonel Murphy, appointed by Montgomery to interrogate him. However, Murphy never asked him a single question. As soon as he arrived, he demanded confirmation of the control measures. "Did they check your mouth?" he asked. "Nazis often hide something under their tongue or in a set of dentures. A capsule in a pocket could just be a decoy." The doctor, following orders, examined him again, but the moment he asked him to open his mouth, Himmler snapped his jaws shut. A sharp click resounded, and within seconds Himmler fell. Thus, on May 23, 1945, Heinrich Himmler, the architect of Nazi terror and head of the Gestapo, met his end. That day marked the end of one of the most powerful and feared men of the Third Reich. Of all the Gestapo leaders, only Heinrich Müller, Himmler's faithful enforcer and absolute head of the secret police, seemed to escape the fate that awaited the others. In early May 1945, he disappeared without a trace. Some German officers repatriated from Soviet camps claimed that Müller was in Moscow. According to Schellenberg, he managed to take advantage of the trial against the Red Orchestra to establish ties with Soviet intelligence and offered himself to them in the final days of the Reich. Numerous members of the German secret services tried to save themselves by switching sides and offering their expertise to the Americans, British, or French, and quite a few succeeded. Müller, on the other hand, reportedly opted for the Russians, although his brutality during the investigations against the Red Orchestra would make such a hypothesis difficult to accept. Even so, doubt persists. Certain sources claim that he died in Moscow in 1948. Other, more recent, reports suggest that he managed to reach Chile, where he would have sought refuge with Martin Bormann. Kaltenbrunner, on the other hand, suffered a different fate. He was arrested like Göring, and both appeared at the Nuremberg trials. After a trial that began on November 20, 1945, and lasted 403 public sessions, the tribunal delivered its verdict on October 1, 1946. Death sentence. Kaltenbrunner was executed by hanging on October 16th.